Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Kaîs Saied wins a landslide victory in Tunisia's presidential elections. Preliminary results give the political outsider 73% of the vote from Sunday's election. A former law professor wants to overhaul the government. Also, Mozambique's gearing up for its general election on Tuesday. Security and the economy are key issues in a vote that's seen the opposition Renamo party put in a surprisingly strong showing against President Filipe Nyusi's ruling Frelimo. And Benin struggles with the fallout of Nigeria's closure of its borders to overland goods back in August. Abuja says that the protectionist measure meant to crack down on smuggling is here to stay for the foreseeable future. But first, a preliminary count from Tunisia's election commission has shown a firm victory of Kaîs Saied in the presidential elections. The Islamist-backed law professor appears to have beaten his rival, media mogul Nabil Kaoui, in Sunday's runoff vote. The split was 72.71% to about 77.29%. Kaoui's conceded defeat, and Saied promised to overhaul the country's government.
He's the outsider who came out on top in the first round of voting without any party support. With his trademark immaculate suit and rigid posture, 61-year-old Kaîs Saied is a political novice who has promised to overhaul the constitution. He took a chance by throwing his own money into his election campaign, often venturing out into the streets to come face to face with ordinary voters. Saied has worked hard to cultivate his image as an ordinary citizen who relies on no one for support. A strength he says will boost his candidacy.
I don't belong to any political party. I am nobody's candidate. I'm independent, and that's how I plan to stay.
He insists he's an incorruptible candidate who will stay above the political fray. Nicknamed Robocop for his austere manners, the constitutional law professor is also known for his strict interpretation of the law and the Quran.
The Quran is clear on the issue. It's not our place to freely interpret it. Those who want equality between men and women can focus on doing it in everyday life.
He made a name for himself during frequent television appearances, where he became known as a straight-talking conservative and a strong advocate of the constitution. Saied has called for a complete shake-up of Tunisia's political scene and its parliament. He accuses the country's political leaders of betraying the spirit of the 2011 revolution and promises to restore Tunisia's faith in democracy.
Well, some polling stations in northern Mozambique may be relocated ahead of Tuesday's general election. It's a precaution against attacks by rebels who've been blamed for killing hundreds of people since late 2017. Now, the unrest in Cabo Delgado threatens to disrupt plans to exploit huge natural gas reserves there, a key campaign promise of incumbent President Filipe Nyusi. Now, his Frelimo party's won every election since independence in 1975. But the leader of the opposition Renamo party has put in a surprisingly strong showing ahead of this week's vote. Frank Kersey's been following preparations for us and joins us now with more from Maputo. Frank, so tell us a bit more about these concerns for those polling stations for Tuesday's vote.
Well, it might not just be a case of polling stations being relocated and the knock-on issues of how to get voters to those. We're actually getting reports of certain stations being closed during polling day, and as would have it, they are in areas of opposition support. But it's not just in this oil and gas-rich Cabo Delgado region where there have been problems in the campaign period. The country's actually seen the worst campaign violence ever. There have been at least 7 assassinations and almost 40 other deaths by accident, and another 300 people injured so far. We spoke to a lawyer today who said that there's always been post-election violence for previous rounds, but this time the election violence in the campaign period has been much worse, making many fear that the post-electoral crisis could be much worse this time. What we think could be one of the biggest issues during polling is that when people go to the polling stations to vote, they have so little trust in the authorities and the system that they actually stay around after voting to keep an eye on the situation themselves. And so what we're going to be seeing this time around is that people will be kept behind a 300-metre exclusion zone, but we're having very mixed messages from the authorities about how they're going to deal with these people who stay around to keep an eye on things. Also, there's perhaps another big problem will be the issue of the observers. And there are thousands of observers accredited to go into polling stations to keep an eye on things, but over 3,000 independent observers have yet to receive their permission to do this. That means that in some parts of the country there'll be almost none or absolutely zero independent oversight. The EU observer team has only 76 people in the whole country, so for some of the problems we may just never know.
Frank, despite all of this potential for friction, the vote does come after that historic peace accord signed between Frelimo and Renamo back in August. So the country is, on some level at least, hoping to turn a significant corner with this election. How do you see things shaping up going forward?
Well, yes, really what we're seeing here are many of the same issues as in previous elections, but both the opportunities and the problems for the country are much bigger. So we've had corruption as an issue beforehand, but since the last election, there's that $2 billion loan scandal. There's been the gas situation bubbling away for quite a long time. But this time, things are actually moving forward, and there are $50 billion of deals from multinational energy companies. And we've also always had this animosity between Frelimo and Renamo, but the stakes are higher again there. Because another thing that we're seeing during the elections is that there are going to be votes for the first time for provincial governors. And it's thought that if Renamo, the opposition party, doesn't get enough people in these provincial polls, then there could be violence from the Renamo side. And also, this time around, the Renamo party itself has divided with a military junta which is pushing away from the central Renamo party. And so really, it's the same issues as before, but the stakes are much higher, as we found out on the campaign trail.
Red has long been the colour of power in Mozambique, the red of Frelimo, the Marxist-Leninist party which has ruled since independence. Its president, Filipe Nyusi, intends to hold on to that power.
Peace, peace, peace. In our vocabulary, we don't have the word for war. We don't talk about it. It doesn't exist.
But war is central to the party's history, a history the incumbent president will have a hard time rewriting. His party won the War of Independence, only to plunge into 16 years of conflict with Renamo, whose militia still hide out in the mountains in central Mozambique, where the civil war never really ended. Osufa Mamade, leader of the Renamo party and opposition candidate, faces dissension as the military faction refuses to disarm despite the peace agreement. Human rights monitors are highly concerned.
After the elections, there will still be armed men from Renamo out there who might be willing again to go back to the bush and fight the governing party in order to make political gains.
The opposition accuses the ruling party of unfair tactics. While 76 European Union observers have been deployed, it's a drop in the ocean for a country larger than any in Europe.
No electoral process can be complete if national observers are not allowed to participate or have some difficulties in participating.
Almost 4,000 local observers have not been accredited during what's become the most violent campaign the country has ever seen. 7 people have been murdered, 300 injured.
The younger generation, when they see blood, when they see people killed in the daylight, in such a brutality, they prefer to stay away. There is also an element here of intimidating people not to turn and vote for change.
Stakes are significantly higher for these elections as billions of dollars flow into Mozambique for gas projects. And while all is calm now, the two main parties remain armed. And many here fear that those who see the election as rigged could draw the country into post-electoral crisis.
Well, thanks a lot for that report there, Frank. He will be following the election day for us. So do join us again at Eye on Africa for Frank's take on the proceedings of election day in Mozambique. Thanks a lot, Frank. See you tomorrow. Well, in other news, police officers have added their voices to the growing public condemnation of the levels of violence against women in South Africa. On Monday, over 1,000 marched through the streets of the capital. It's one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a woman. Last year, at least 2,700 women were murdered by men. The numbers for rape are equally as shocking, with an estimated 137 victims a day. Figures could be much higher, though, as many assaults go unreported. Those that are often aren't investigated thoroughly, and calls are growing for police to do more to end a culture of impunity. And Nigeria's customs chief said that a ban on importing goods overland will stay put for as long as it takes. The protectionist measure was brought in August in a bid to reduce the amount of rice and other food staples being smuggled in. But the move has been devastating to neighbouring Benin. Our correspondents report.
Hundreds of lorries have been stuck at the Seme-Krake border in southern Benin since August, after Nigeria's surprise announcement banning all food imports into the country.
I'm transporting butter and we've been stuck here for around 2 months. It's becoming really complicated for us.
Further north, the situation is much the same. Nothing is getting into Nigeria. Several warehouses have been forced to close. This salesman used to receive hundreds of tons of rice exclusively for the Nigerian market. But since the country's banned all rice imports from Asia, he says he's lost around 180 million euros.
For the moment, we don't have a solution for the goods we have in stock, unless President Buhari opens the border.
Even produce made in Benin has been forbidden. These tomatoes are no longer allowed into Nigeria. This saleswoman is forced to sell her merchandise at a loss on the local market.
We've got 25 lorries stuck at the border. All our merchandise is ruined. One of my colleagues has died of a heart attack because of this. I was able to look after my children thanks to this business.
Commercial exports to Nigeria represent around 20% of Benin's GDP. Unless the border reopens, the country's economy could falter.
Our economic actors are going to face colossal losses from the port operators and banks and so on. It's going to lead to a negative chain of events at all levels.
Benin's Cotonou port receives around 10 million tonnes of merchandise annually, half of which is destined for Nigeria. If the country upholds the blockade on foreign goods, Benin's main port, already congested by shipping containers, risks being brought to a standstill.
Well, that is it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.